It's 7 o'clock. This is a Sky News special on the war in Ukraine from here in the city of Lviv. Our top story, an ominous warning from the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson tells Sky News he fears Russia's president may deploy chemical weapons here in Ukraine.
The stuff that you're hearing about chemical weapons, this is straight out of their playbook.
Worlds apart, the highest level talks between both sides conclude with no agreement on a ceasefire. Victims of strikes in Mariupol are buried in mass graves as the attacks continue. The former head of NATO says military action by the West should not be ruled out.
We are confronted with a political gangster in the Kremlin, and in defense against gangsters, you should not exclude any action.
And unable to buy players or sell tickets, Chelsea feels the sharp end of sanctions on its owner, Roman Abramovich. Good evening. The Prime Minister has told Sky News that he fears President Putin could deploy chemical weapons as part of Russia's invasion of this country. Boris Johnson has been speaking exclusively to our political editor, Beth Rigby.
I'll make you one other prediction, by the way, which is that the stuff that you're hearing about chemical weapons, this is straight out of their playbook. They start saying that there are chemical weapons that have been stored by their opponents or by the Americans, and so when they themselves deploy chemical weapons, as I fear they may, they have a sort of a maskirovka, a fake story ready to go. And you've seen it in Syria. You saw it even in the UK when.
This is what you expect next, then.
Look, I just note that is what they're already doing. It is a cynical, barbaric government, I'm afraid.
Let's go live to Westminster and our chief political correspondent, John Craig. So, John, why is Boris Johnson bringing this up now?
Prime Minister wants to hammer home the message that we first heard yesterday from Western officials who warned of a Syrian-style chemical attack following the brutal attack on a maternity hospital in Ukraine. Now, that warning from the officials was then prompted the White House press secretary, that's Jen Psaki, to talk about false claims. When the PM talks about a fake story, the White House is using the phrase false claims about alleged US biological weapons labs and chemical weapons deployment in Ukraine. And the White House has said we should all be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons. Liz Truss earlier on today, she's in Washington, said we're very concerned about the potential use of chemical weapons. We've seen Russia use these weapons before in fields of conflict, and it'd be a grave mistake, a phrase the PM's used many times. The Prime Minister said in his interview with Beth Rigby there, you've seen it in Syria, you saw it even in the UK. That obviously is a reference to the Salisbury poisoning a few years ago. And this is a warning we are likely to hear reinforced in the coming days from Boris Johnson and indeed senior ministers like Liz Truss and no doubt the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. It's a message we'll hear from both London and Washington, but the Prime Minister has spelled it out very clearly in his interview with Beth Rigby here on Sky News.
OK, John, thank you very much. Well, you can watch Beth Rigby's exclusive interview with the Prime Minister in full this evening here on Sky News. That's on her new programme, Beth Rigby Interviews, this evening at 9 o'clock. Let's go then to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's here with me in Western Ukraine. And this issue of the potential use of chemical weapons, Deborah, how seriously will NATO be taking this?
Well, let's just sort of talk about what it could mean. I mean, in terms of chemical weapons, which are banned, remember, this is like it's a violation of international law to use chemical weapons on the battlefield. It was a red line that then President Obama drew during the Syria conflict and then allowed Russia and the Russia-backed Syrian regime to cross that red line with the use of chemical weapons, sarin gas attacks in Syria without the overwhelming consequences that should have ensured that violation of international norms wasn't allowed to go unpunished in a way that would deter future use. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, that we are where we are today, with ministers even talking about this. Interesting, talking about the possibility of it happening, but not offering any suggestion of a threat that would deter the use of that from happening, which I think really again underlines the difficulty that Western allies have with this conflict. They obviously are supporting the Ukrainian forces, but they aren't going so far that it would put themselves in direct military confrontation with Russia. And so it's a really difficult balancing act. And in terms of why we're even thinking about this, it has a lot to do with how badly the war is going for Russia. I mean, here we are, we're in the third week now of this invasion, and Russia has yet to capture and significantly hold territory. Yes, it has taken Kherson, for example, in the south, but you're still seeing Ukrainian protests on the street, anti-Russian protests. There's no sense of them making any significant, meaningful movement on the capital. And in desperation, in frustration perhaps, you escalate up the violence, and that's the kind of threat that we're seeing, and that's why you're getting these warnings.
OK, Deborah, thank you very much. Well, the most high-level diplomatic talks in the conflict so far have failed to make any progress today. Russia's Sergei Lavrov demanded that Ukraine be disarmed, denazified and accept neutral status. Ukraine said Russia's demands amounted to asking them to surrender. Meanwhile, bombardments have continued in several cities here. Aid authorities have tried to open several humanitarian corridors today to evacuate civilians from besieged towns and cities. The priority was to get people out of Mariupol, where 3 people, including a child, were killed in yesterday's strike on a hospital. The city has been blockaded by Russia for 9 days now, but no one was evacuated today at all, and the city was once again under attack from the air. Emergency services report that more than 12,000 civilians did manage to leave the region of Sumy successfully today. The governor of Izium, which has been under constant attack, reports that 1,600 people evacuated that town today, and people continue to escape fierce fighting in towns on the outskirts of Kiev. A steady stream of people has been crossing a makeshift bridge from Irpin towards the relative safety of the capital. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military says Russia is continuing its strategy of shelling major cities around the country. Well, today's talks failed to reach any significant announcements on ceasefires or humanitarian corridors. Our diplomatic editor Dominic Waghorn reports now from Turkey.
In the besieged city of Mariupol, there is no time to give the dead dignity. No respectful burial, thrown instead into a trench filling with bodies, one after another, in scenes we thought were consigned to the middle of the last century, but happening now in a European city.
The only thing I want is for this to be finished. I don't know who's guilty, who's right, who started this. Damn them all, those people who started this.
1,200 have been killed in attacks ripping apart the city's streets and homes, launched by one of the world's most advanced militaries, reducing living in this seaside resort town to a struggle to survive. In another resort, this one in Turkey, Russia's foreign minister arrived smiling for the highest level talks since the invasion began. But after just an hour and a half, they ended with Ukraine's foreign minister emerging sounding frustrated.
My impression is that Russia is not in a position at this point to establish a ceasefire. They seek a surrender from Ukraine, but this is not what they are going to get.
Then the Russians' turn. Sergei Lavrov is a sharp operator who chooses his words carefully. But listen to this and wonder what planet he's on.
We're not planning to attack other countries. We did not attack Ukraine.
You said some time ago that Russia had no intention to invade Ukraine. I think today you said that Russia did not invade Ukraine when it clearly has. Why should the Ukrainians take you seriously, with all due respect? Why should they believe a word you say and the rest of the world?
This is not about Ukraine. This is about the aggression against anything Russian. Interests, religion, language, culture, safety. And of course now the reaction of the West to our actions. Very aggressive reaction.
Russia has sent its foreign minister here to talk peace, but without a mandate to discuss ceasefires or a new humanitarian aid corridor, claim the Ukrainians. It's hard to see what these talks have achieved, apart from the fact that they have happened and could happen again. In Versailles in France, European leaders met to discuss Ukraine. But no, the West's strategy of using sanctions to deter Russian aggression has so far failed. Russia's advance is being blocked. Its tanks here picked off one by one. But the more its military fails, the more barbaric it seems its tactics, and the more the people of Ukraine suffer its onslaught. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Antalya.
Let's bring in our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magne. And Diana, how have these talks today been viewed by the Kremlin?
Well, there's been no follow-up from the Kremlin on the talks between Russia's foreign minister and his Ukrainian counterpart. But we do know that Vladimir Putin had a phone call with the South African president later this afternoon and briefed him on the talks and also on what Russia insists on calling its special military operation in Ukraine. We've just heard from Cyril Ramaphosa that he has been asked to mediate, try and find a negotiated settlement to this crisis. So that means that you have Turkey, Israel and South Africa all offering a hand, a mediating hand in this process. But we certainly don't seem to be any closer to any kind of compromise, certainly as far as those talks in the morning went. We also know that Vladimir Putin spoke to his German and French counterparts in a joint phone call this morning, and both of them urged an immediate ceasefire and said a negotiated solution was the only way out of all of this. Further to what Sergei Lavrov said in that press conference about the bombing of a hospital in Mariupol, of the maternity hospital, Russia's Ministry of Defense has now said that that was a staged information provocation by the Kiev regime. Now, I'm sure that the Kiev regime will push back very hard on that. And we heard earlier from President Zelensky saying war crimes are not possible without propagandists who cover them up. So you can see the kind of rhetoric on both sides about that terrible bombing in Mariupol that we witnessed yesterday. We've also had interesting developments on the economic front. I mean, the last week in Moscow, just seeing all the foreign companies that have pulled up, the shops that have boarded up, and of course, foreign companies pulling out across the whole country. Vladimir Putin had a meeting with his cabinet and to discuss how to mitigate the effect of sanctions. And he said that Russia would have to adapt, but that it would come out stronger, and that he would continue to deal essentially with those countries that weren't cooperating with the sanctions regime on Russia. He also said that, and this is following a conversation that's been going on for a few days now, that Russia might place or would consider placing foreign assets, idled foreign assets here in Russia under external administration, effectively bringing in Russian managers to make sure that supply chains and Russian staff were kept in jobs. Now, that's a pretty dramatic proposition, essentially nationalising foreign assets for companies that have moved out. And Vladimir Potanin, who's one of the biggest businessmen in this country, interestingly turned around and said we should approach that kind of thing with extreme caution. It would set Russia back 100 years, and it would mean that investors would mistrust Russia for decades to come.
Diana, thank you very much. Let's go to our international affairs editor then, Dominic Waghorn. who is in Turkey. And Dominic, if Sergei Lavrov is saying that Russia has not invaded Ukraine, I mean, what kind of hope is there going forward?
Yeah, I mean, he's a well-respected diplomat. He's someone who chooses his words carefully. Was he there just sticking to the script? Because don't forget, Russia has banned describing this invasion as an invasion and banned the use of the word war, says it's a special military operation. Or was he engaging in something more sinister? Was this kind of Orwellian doublespeak where you say one thing but you mean the other? Because what he said there was that Russia has no intention of invading any other countries. In fact, he says Russia has not invaded Ukraine. So I think policymakers in the West will be looking at that and trying to read whether there's a further threat there. And if you look at Vladimir Putin's speeches, he has made it pretty clear that the grievance he feels is acting over on Ukraine is also a grievance he harbours over the Baltic states as well. And there is certainly a way of interpreting what he said about Ukraine, suggesting that he may well do the same in the Baltic states. But what we saw effectively in these talks were a complete failure to reach any ceasefire, any further humanitarian aid corridor agreements. The Russians kept saying, well, we have to refer back to Moscow, as they've been saying in Belarus as well. And on the Russian side, it was really a masterclass in misinformation. We had various conflicting stories about that maternity hospital in Mariupol, as Diana was saying there. The Russian Minister of Defence now saying that this was staged by the Ukrainians. Earlier on today, Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson today, said that these pictures were faked. Her then boss then went on to say, no, he believed the attack did happen, carried out by the Russian military, but it was targeting Ukrainian Nazis who were basing their activities within that building. So two contradictory versions of the same event there, which is typical Russian misinformation. I think we're going to see more of that in the weeks and months to come. But I think the crucial fact that's come out of the talks today is they haven't achieved anything. There is an agreement to meet on this sort of higher level, if you like, again and again. But based on what we've seen today, I think hopes have to be managed as to whether this diplomacy is going to achieve anything.
Yeah, OK, Dominic, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, it was once a normal hospital on the outskirts of Kiev. Now it's the nearest medical facility to the front line and is given over entirely to treating wounded Ukrainian soldiers. The staff have no training in treating shrapnel injuries or gunshot wounds, but now find themselves part of the war effort against the Russian invaders. And a warning, our special correspondent Alex Crawford's report does show some distressing images.
They arrive stuffed into car boots and on the back seats. They're taking some terrible hits trying to stop the Russian troops entering the Ukrainian capital, laid out on already blood-soaked stretchers. The soldiers have just been shelled on a front line which is creeping ever closer to Kyiv. And it's the nearest hospital, now entirely turned over to dealing with the war wounded. These aren't army medics, they're the town's doctors and nurses who 2 weeks ago were dealing with births and bone breaks. Now they're plunged into a new world, spent trying to save the lives of soldiers and civilians torn apart by bombs and bullets.
It's the World War III.
It's World War III.
It's World War III, and it could be stopped here, or it could move through the all the world. Please help us to stop this war.
They are shell-shocked and shaking, and so far the politicians' peace talks have got nowhere. Hospitals are protected locations under international law, but no one here trusts that to be observed. Yet there's an astonishing resilience and perhaps a realization they have no option. It's not difficult for us to fight, he tells us. We're defending our land and will continue to protect it. But then he delivers a rousing call, not just to his fellow Ukrainian men and women, but also the rest of the world. Everyone has to stand together, he says. Glory to Ukraine, our army will win. This is on the northwest edge of the capital, and we found multiple vehicles and homes which had been hit, apparently indiscriminately. There seems to be no shortage of lucky escapes. He was on duty as an emergency worker.
So you just live close by?
His house 5 houses from here.
There are thousands of lives abruptly halted by this war. pets abandoned in the rush to keep out of the way of the rockets and bombs. Families who've upped and left everything just to try to survive.
There's a constant sound of artillery and shelling going on, and you can see the devastation that some of the attacks have already had. We know, according to the locals here, that the Russians are only a few kilometers down the road, and this is the constant backdrop.
So those who can't or won't leave live in a shadowy underground world below the booming war sounds. About half of the capital's population has fled the city, according to the mayor.
It smells good. Smells good.
We're just waiting for victory, for everything to be good again, she says, and trying not to cry. These are the bravest of women, tending to some of the community's most vulnerable and most frightened. We've already learnt how to tell the difference between our side's shooting and the enemy's, Natalia tells us. We can identify everything, and we're just trying to keep everyone calm. They're already living under siege here, with sons and partners fighting and their homes bombed. For sure, this is a crime, and Putin has to be punished, she tells us.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, how's it going?
Those fleeing include a former British soldier who'd been living in Bucha, had to pass through Russian troops to escape, and saw dozens of civilian targets had been attacked.
I saw a lot of vehicles, civilian vehicles, destroyed on the road. Dead bodies still inside are strewn onto the road. Even vehicles, people have been marking their vehicles with the Ukrainian or the Russian word for child on their vehicles if they have children. A bunch of those vehicles were also destroyed with children markings.
They're engaged in the fight of their lives to stop the Russian troops advancing any further. But their president's warning, much more of their blood will be spilt unless his nation gets international military support. Alex Crawford, Sky News, on the edge of the capital, Kyiv.
Well, Chelsea Football Club is facing huge restrictions on the way it operates after its owner, Roman Abramovich, was sanctioned by the UK government. Mr. Abramovich is one of 7 Russian billionaires to face new curbs, which include asset freezes and travel bans. Ministers say it's part of a move against those linked to the Russian regime. The restrictions mean games can still go ahead, players can be paid but not bought or sold, and no new tickets can be sold. Sky's Ali Fortescue reports.
He is Britain's best-known oligarch. But Roman Abramovich's 2 decades at Chelsea, an enviable London property portfolio, have been undone by his links to Russia and to President Putin. Abramovich's assets and the club that he transformed frozen. His name added to the list of billionaires sanctioned by Britain.
It's important that he doesn't benefit from the club. Our priority is to ensure that the club is protected, that the fans are protected, and the national game.
It's an extraordinary moment for foreign policy and for football. Chelsea will now have to operate under a special licence. That means season ticket holders can go to games, but fans can't buy new tickets. They'll be subject to a transfer ban, blocked from negotiating new contracts. The club can't sell merchandise. 3 have already suspended their sponsorship. And whilst reasonable travel costs for players will be covered, longer trips abroad could be difficult.
All the fans all over the world are devastated right now.
Do you think they've gone too far with this?
I think they've, obviously there's a massive issue in Ukraine, but him leaving, it's just, I feel like the club's just dying.
Right now, the value of our club in terms of achievements, quality of players, location, I'm not worried. A little setback, but we'll bounce back stronger.
The government will have been making sure their case was absolutely legally watertight before sanctioning Roman Abramovich. It is a big move. It means he faces a UK travel ban and his assets, including Chelsea, are frozen. And that makes the process of selling this club much more complicated. The billionaire had already confirmed that Chelsea's being sold. The profits, he said, will go to victims of the war in Ukraine.
It effectively would have to be sold via the approval of the government, or the government appointing someone to work alongside the sellers to ensure that any sale proceeds went into an account which could not be accessed by Roman Abramovich. I think it does call into question the Premier League's approach to allowing individuals to come in and buy football clubs without having any form of human rights clauses.
6 others have also been sanctioned today, among them Mr Abramovich's former business partner, Oleg Deripaska, and Igor Sechin, whose yacht was seized by the French last week. But for the man so deeply entwined in British football, lauded, even recently, by some of the most high-profile players, whose name less than a week ago was a rallying cry from Chelsea fans at Burnley. It is a moment many believed wouldn't come. Chelsea's game tonight against Norwich will go ahead. What happens next for the club is much less certain. Ali Fortescue, Sky News.
This is Sky News Tonight. Coming up, will a new digital visa application scheme make it easier for the thousands of refugees desperate to reach their families in the UK?
I am there to speak truth to power. Questions to ask the questions that people want answered. Yeah, good to see you. When I'm interviewing a politician, it's more rapid fire, but this is not. This is a conversation. The format of the show. So we're going to have an hour-long interview show once a week on a Thursday night. It's at 9 p.m. It's a moment to press pause on this frenetic pace of news and just reflect on things. And when we do have a politician on the show, you might see them interviewed by me in a different way than you perhaps normally see it. What they do, why they do it. If I can find some of that and bring it onto Sky News, I'd be really happy.
Welcome back to Ukraine. There's to be a change in the UK's visa scheme for Ukrainians seeking sanctuary in Britain. From Tuesday, the process will go digital, so people with a passport won't need to go to an application centre in Europe. It should speed up the process, but it still excludes anyone without a passport. The Home Secretary has faced fierce criticism that the UK dragged its feet in response to the refugee crisis. Sky's Laura Bundock reports from Lille in northern France.
A fortnight ago, they had jobs, schools and homes. Now they are refugees. 3 cousins and their 4 children.
In the port, yeah, we sit on the floor. We wait in 10 hours with kids.
They have family in the UK, but 7 long visa forms, all in English, took hours.
Every time it's different information. Every 2 hours. Some change, and need plus new documents, plus new translators. Everything's new. Some family help in Ukraine and send, and now we make everything and translate and yeah.
So you've had to have family in Ukraine send you information?
Yes, my mom is her mom, yeah.
It is unbelievably difficult. With their husbands in Kyiv now fighters, they just want somewhere safe to stay.
We don't need some benefit, we don't need nothing because we have his family. We need some 1, 2, 3 months, I don't know, when the situation in Ukraine will be good. We are just back.
And everyone here has a similar story.
Things aren't just complicated, they are constantly changing. A day ago, people were brought here from Calais, where they were told there was a visa centre opening nearby in Lille. Now they're told it'll open on Friday, not here, but in Arras, and that's an hour away.
Some have made it through. In the early hours, Maria brought her Ukrainian mum to Edinburgh.
People have nowhere to go. Some people run out of money. People stay, they have no home. They just want to make to their family, and the whole process is too long, too complicated.
After days on the road, they're all off to Paris to finish the applications.
Does it feel welcoming to you, the UK?
No, he not say welcome. No. Yeah. But we try, we're strong. Yeah.
They've left their hearts in Ukraine, but their hope now lies in Britain. Laura Bundock, Sky News in Lille.
This is Sky News Tonight. Coming up, the former head of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, tells Sky News nothing should be off the table when it comes to dealing with Russia. That and more after the break. Welcome back to Western Ukraine. The former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen has told me that NATO may need to act sooner rather than later to intervene in this conflict. Mr. Rasmussen said the decision to rule out a no-fly zone is encouraging Vladimir Putin to commit more atrocities. I spoke to him a little earlier and asked him whether the situation on the ground could further deteriorate.
I think they will get worse because the Russians are not advancing as planned, so Putin will get more desperate, and that will lead to more devastating warfare.
How do you think Putin can be stopped? What more must be done, do you think, to stop him?
First of all, I think we should step up our delivery of weapons to the Ukrainians. They have demonstrated great bravery, and we should help them all we can. So we should help them with drones, with anti-tank equipment, better air defense systems, etc., etc.
We've seen the attacks on civilians. We've seen the attack on the hospital. Is there not now a moral case, a humanitarian case for a more significant military intervention, given what is happening here now? Maybe a no-fly zone or something like that?
It is indeed heartbreaking to watch the images of Russian bombings of civilians. So at this stage, I would not exclude anything. I think it's a mistake that Western leaders are busy excluding this and that action. We are confronted with a political gangster in the Kremlin, and in defense against gangsters, you should not exclude any action.
So would you be thinking seriously now about something like a no-fly zone or some other military intervention here?
First of all, I would declare economic war against Russia. I think that's what is needed here and now to stop the revenue from oil and gas purchase in Russia, to completely cut Russia off the international economic system. But concerning the no-fly zone, I think it should still be on the table. It could be to protect humanitarian corridors. It could be to protect Western Ukraine. But let's be clear-eyed about this. The Russians would consider it a declaration of war.
Absolutely. But by ruling it out, you think, do you, that it is in some ways encouraging Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely, because Vladimir Putin only respects one thing: force and determination and unity. So we shouldn't exclude anything. He should be kept in doubt about our intentions. But here now, I think we should stop the revenue that finances his war. So I would suggest that the European Union immediately stop all purchase of oil and gas from Russia.
So what is the red line for you militarily? If NATO is not going to act now, and they've acted before in places like Libya and so forth, if NATO is not going to act now, what does it take for NATO to act militarily?
I think we should follow the development very closely, and if Russia continues to target civilians, bombing of hospitals, as we have seen, not to speak about if they use chemical weapons in Ukraine, I would consider that crossing a red line.
And that would mean military action, which could lead to a broader war, but you would still go ahead with that, would you?
Of course, we have to think this through very thoroughly, because a no-fly zone might make more harm than good by expanding the conflict beyond Ukraine's borders. And of course, we don't want that. And that's why I think here and now, my preferred option would be actually to declare an outright economic war against Russia by stopping the purchase of oil and gas, and actually we can handle it in Europe. It will be tough. It will come at a price, but that price would be very low compared to the current suffering of the Ukrainian people, and it would be a tiny price compared to the loss of freedom if we do not act now.
I think you've met Mr. Putin. How far do you think he is prepared to go in all this?
I'm concerned that he won't stop in Ukraine. If he succeeds in Ukraine, next step could be Moldova and Georgia, and in the worst case, also against the Baltic states. So we may have a choice between confronting Mr. Putin now or later. And history has taught us that the suffering and the losses might be less by confronting such dictators at an early stage rather than too late.
And if NATO did act now, maybe militarily, do you think that Putin would back down?
Yeah, at least I think if he gets good advice, he would realize that Russia has no chance whatsoever against NATO. But again, let me stress, I do not want a military confrontation with Russia. I think a declaration of economic war would be more efficient.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin is behaving irrationally? Do you think he's behaving delusionally over all this?
Mr. Putin is definitely behaving irrationally, because rational thinking wouldn't have led him to attack Ukraine. And he has been through an incredible change of mind. I met him first time in 2002. At that time, he enthusiastically argued in favor of a strengthened cooperation between Russia and the West. Since then, he changed his mind, attacked Georgia, attacked Ukraine. So he has changed his mind over time.
And just finally, do you think there is a diplomatic way out of this, and soon?
It's hard to see because Russia has presented what I would call maximalistic demands that eventually would lead to the dissolution of Ukraine as an independent and sovereign state. Of course, we have to adhere to the principle that all sovereign countries have a right to decide their alliance affiliation themselves. And that's exactly what Putin tries to deprive Ukraine of that right. Putin is obsessed by the idea to restore the greatness of Russia. And that's why he wants to control the territory of the former Soviet Union, and we shouldn't allow him to do that.
Okay, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Well, as the refugee exodus continues out of Ukraine, Poland has so far accepted over 1 million people. Many Poles feel a sense of solidarity with their Ukrainian neighbours, fearing the dominance, of course, of Russia approaching their own country. Some have gladly offered to house families fleeing the war. The authorities have allowed people to cross the border with very little bureaucracy in contrast to the UK, but with so many flooding into Poland, the strain is now beginning to show. Sky's Lisa Holland reports from Warsaw.
It's just 2 weeks since Poland became a beacon of sanctuary for Ukrainian refugees. Now, by their own admission, the capital Warsaw is just about coping and close to being overwhelmed. At the central station, a sea of people, some just off trains from Ukraine, hungry, thirsty and tired. But the refugees are grateful to volunteers for the most basic of things, like a toothbrush and helping them get back on their feet.
I had to change the money for her because there is a queue. So we have to go and take the tickets.
You've got a lot of people that you need to help.
As you can see.
Just not stopping, is it?
It's not. Well, it is. It's just, I don't know how long it's going to be, but probably for a long time.
Warsaw has welcomed the equivalent of 15% of its previous population, and nobody knows how many are staying.
Where do you plan to go to?
We don't know. We don't know.
No idea. Poland?
No, we have no
Germany?
idea. No.
Having arrived safely from Ukraine, the refugees then need somewhere to go or stay. These people are queuing for a bus for Germany. They have no idea when it will leave or even which city they'll end up in.
Some have slept rough for days, waiting for somewhere else to go. Others, like Gregory and his 87-year-old mother, who can barely walk, just want to reach a European country where they have friends.
We have no home, we have no cars, we have no nothing, only these 3 baggage. Oh, that's all.
This family would like to go to the UK but aren't eligible as they have no family ties. But they can see the pressure mounting on the authorities in Warsaw.
We are going to Germany because too much our citizens in Poland. We don't want to bother Poland people.
Warsaw says it needs help, calling on the rest of Europe and the UK to step up.
I am afraid that this is just a beginning. So I think you could today think about your offer for them. If you could provide something, it would be really welcome.
The refugee crisis is getting worse by the day, which means it's likely to be a long time before any of these people truly find some peace. Lisa Holland, Sky News, Warsaw.
This is Sky News Tonight. Coming up, it'll make life difficult for Chelsea, but what else will freezing Roman Abramovich's assets achieve? We'll talk to an anti-corruption activist next.
Independent United Kingdom.
These last few years have seen some huge stories. And these stories have been driven by politics, by politicians, the people in power.
You must stay at home.
And it's my job to figure out how these decisions made by politicians impact all of us in our everyday lives.
This is the worst thing I've ever been through in my life.
People turn up here with their child stuff in a black sack and just say, I don't want them.
And that is what it is. It's first-class poverty.
Is this an example of the welfare state failing?
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
These are stories that affect us all. Millions of children are now having to catch up. Some stories have changed all of our lives. Because like the residents, the staff are being infected. Politicians, they make decisions all of the time, and it's our job to hold them to account. I wonder if you will take this opportunity to apologise to those families. But in the end, the real power doesn't actually lie with the politicians. the real power lies with the people. I'm Nick Martin. I'm the People and Politics correspondent at Sky News.
We're going to talk more now about sanctions and the decision to freeze the assets of Roman Abramovich. It's left Chelsea Football Club in a kind of suspended animation, still functioning but unable to sign new players, negotiate new contracts, sell new tickets or sell any merchandise. Well, I'm joined now by Roman Borisovich, who's a political campaigner and anti-corruption activist. Thank you very much for being with us. The government's statement is an extraordinary one, clear about Abramovich's links to Putin, but also suggesting that he may be linked through one of his companies to this destabilization of Ukraine.
Certainly, Mark. Well, I guess, Putin is the real owner of Abramovich's assets, and this is finally the realization is finally coming to the West that whatever you want to call him, trustee, wallet, but the money that Abramovich is managing is not entirely his, and that's been very clear from the moment when he bought Chelsea. The transaction that was viewed as making him a very rich person was really legitimizing Russian kleptocracies, Putin's money in London.
So what impact will this have then on him as an individual? And do you think other countries may act as well?
I would sincerely hope so, because, UK is not enough. And the efforts with regard to these oligarchs need to be truly global. Abramovich has properties and assets in France and in the States, all over the globe. So freezing of assets has to be truly global. We can't really freeze Chelsea here and let him enjoy his palaces in France and his Governor Beach property in St. Bart's.
So what happens then to his homes in London, his yachts and so forth? What will happen now to all that?
Well, now his assets will be frozen, as this is the measure that the government has taken due to the military conflict in Ukraine. Technically, if the conflict stops tomorrow, it has to be unfrozen and returned to Abramovich. Well, what happens to the assets after that entirely depends on the political will of Downing Street. If there is a will to investigate his links to Kremlin, if there is a will to prove that this is Putin's money, it has to be confiscated and most likely given back to the people of Ukraine.
So just explain how he was benefiting from his close links to Vladimir Putin.
He was, as I said, a trustee, if you want to think about in these terms. He was managing money that is not entirely his. He was allowed to have planes or maybe told to have planes to underscore the largesse of Russian oligarchs abroad and to create an image of a very successful independent businessman, which he is not. And this is going to be very painful for Putin to see his assets frozen and his proxy being not able to manage his money.
So what do you think he'll do now? I mean, will he just go back and live in Russia? What will he do you think?
I think he'll find himself some other place on earth. I don't think he wants to go back to Russia. Nobody wants to go back to Russia with these economic sanctions, and especially people who are used to the life of luxury.
So I think he's living in Israel at the moment, isn't he?
He'll probably stay there, and it's very convenient because Israel doesn't have extradition treaty, so he will be off limits to any law enforcement that wants to penalize him for his criminal kleptocracy.
And I'm sure his lawyers will be fighting it. Roman Borisovich, thank you very much indeed for being with us this evening. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is Sky News Tonight. Coming up in the next hour, all the latest developments on the conflict here in Ukraine, as the Prime Minister tells Sky News he fears Russia may use chemical weapons. Dermot Murnaghan is next.